Hi everyone, and welcome to this edition of Sales Still Human Masterclass series. Today, I want to share some insights around the science of how people buy and how they make those buying decisions. And the foundational principle is that we buy as human beings and not as job functions. Now, the psychology of buying and selling really starts with everyone understanding how their brain works. Whether you're selling to a consumer or you're selling to a business, buying decisions ultimately are made by humans. And as human beings, we have emotions, we have biases, and we often find a way of taking shortcuts to make those decisions. Now, what this means is that our decisions are driven by emotion first and then justified by logic. There are many factors that influence how decisions are made, and we as human beings, how we make those decisions. Now, I'm going to focus on three critical elements that impact buying decisions. Firstly, I'm going to talk a little bit about something called dual system thinking. Secondly, I'm going to focus on emotional drivers that we as human beings have. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about cognitive bias. So the first topic, dual system thinking. Well, this is a topic that was popularized by a guy called Daniel Kahneman in his book, Systems of Thinking. The basic principle is this. There are two brain systems. There is a system 1 and a system 2. Your system 1 brain is your subconscious brain. This is the brain that reacts really quickly. It's instinctive. It's emotional. Your system 1 brain is fast. It's intuitive. Me personally, I like to describe it as your autopilot. So imagine that your brain has been programmed because you've learned things over time and you've done them so many times. Your brain has been programmed to repeat those activities instinctively, intuitively. You don't actually need to think about what you're doing. The kind of things that come to mind for me are, imagine driving a car. The first time you learnt it, it was really hard, but you got used to it. And now it's just an instinctive thing that you do. Your system 1 brain has been programmed so that when you get in a car, you know exactly what to do. The same thing happens in sales, both as salespeople selling and as buyers when we are trying to procure items or products or services or solutions as well. Your system 1 brain is responsible for things like you breathing, for you moving your arms, and everything that ultimately you do that is subconscious. Another example that I like to use is if you use the underground to go to work. What I used to do is subconsciously, I always used to stand at the entry point, get on the train so that when I exit in London, I was right near the exit barrier. So that was just something that was pre-programmed to me. Whenever I got to the station, I would always stand in exactly the same spot. That's how your system 1 brain works. It gets pre-programmed. Now, conversely, your system 2 brain is the complete opposite. It is slow, it's rational, it's analytical. And this means that it can only process a small amount of things at any given moment in time. Now, what happens is that imagine you are going through any kind of change. Let's say you moved house and you are actually now having to use a completely different train station to the one that you used to use. Your system 2 brain has to get engaged because now you got to think, hold up, where do I stand? Which direction is the train going in? Is it going to be in the same spot that I used to stand? So your system 2 brain has to be engaged. It has to slow things down. It has to rationalize. It has to evaluate. Now, your system 2 brain is the thing that actually, whenever you are going through any kind of change, whenever you are learning anything new, your system 2 brain gets engaged. Whenever you are in a new situation that you've never been in before, your system 2 brain gets engaged. Why is this important? It's important because buyers feel first and then they justify later. So even in B2B sales, a buyer's gut instinct shapes what they trust, what their preferences are. And then they apply rational metrics to justify whatever decision that they make. Your past experiences influence that system 1 brain. Your past experiences, good, bad, or indifferent, will actually help you to determine whether something is going in the right direction in the way you want it to go, or whether it's new and actually you need to change something within that process. Okay, so that's dual system thinking, and it's super important when we are considering the impact of buying decisions. The second element that impacts buying decisions are emotional drivers and your emotional intelligence. Now, emotional drivers are what consciously and subconsciously focus and fuel our decisions. Think of it as your motivation based on those past experiences that you had and how you have interpreted whether things are going the way that you want them to go. Marketing folk use these emotional drivers when they are creating advertising campaigns, when they are creating content. They use it to generate engagement, and they use it to grab our attention as buyers, as consumers. Now, in sales, we need to also understand what these drivers are, because I like to think of them as triggers, or they are signals that are telling us what is important to that person, that human being. Give you an example. When we start thinking about, or when we start thinking about these triggers as aspirations, their dreams, we start to realize what is really important to them. What is it that they are working towards? When we think about the pain, we start thinking about the drains. What is actually eating up their time? What is holding them back, perhaps? And then finally, we think about the misconceptions, the way that they perhaps think about something which is perhaps clouding their judgment. It's a doubt that they have. Now, what I often find is that a lot of these emotional drivers are fueled by fear. They're fueled by past experiences. They're fueled by perhaps things that they have seen or heard. These are all emotional triggers. They are all emotional drivers. Let me give you a few examples to bring this to life. Now, when a buyer is thinking about making that buying decision, different emotional drivers, triggers, they're going to show up in different ways. As an example, imagine a maintenance manager or a production manager working in a factory. They are thinking about safety. They are thinking about reducing the risk of failure for that machine going down. Now, from a personal perspective, the emotional driver in a business might be status. It might be the impact on career, i.e. promotion. It might be reputation. It might be recognition. It is a lot more personal. So you have to consider not just one, but the other as well. From a management, from a leadership perspective, it could be around culture and belonging. And it could be to do with team alignment and making sure that there is consensus within the team whenever decisions are being made. And finally, as a business owner, the emotional driver might be a sense of achievement, actually being able to hit the growth targets that perhaps have been set, being able to grow the business so that eventually they are able to sell and exit. Different people are going to have different emotional drivers, and different buyers within any buying organization are going to have different emotional drivers. So why is this important? Well, as salespeople, we have to ensure that we engage all elements of our emotional intelligence when we are interacting with different kinds of buyers. Now, here's the interesting thing. Whenever I ask the question, what is emotional intelligence? More often than not, most people will talk to me about empathy. Their response will include the word empathy. Now, Daniel Goleman, in his book, Emotional Intelligence, actually identified 5 components of emotional intelligence. I'm just going to talk you through them, each one very quickly. And all 5 together are important when we are considering emotional intelligence, when we are processing emotional drivers that we are, those signals, those triggers that we are constantly being thrown at. So the 5 components of emotional intelligence. First one is self-awareness. Self-awareness is about us knowing our abilities and our emotions. It is us knowing actually when we get triggered. It is about us knowing what makes us feel good, what makes us feel not so good. It is about us knowing when our energy is high, when our energy is low. It is about us knowing actually how we respond in different situations, scenarios, circumstances. The second component is self-management. And this is about us being able to control our emotions and our impulses. A great example that I can give you in sales is that we are often triggered when we hear the same challenge that a buyer might have. The typical salesperson will hear that challenge and be ready to jump in and say, I've heard it before, I know the solution to it. Self-management is about being able to control that impulse, that urge to jump in, and instead actually just hold back. Okay, and just instead listen. The third component of emotional intelligence is motivation. What makes us tick? What is it that ultimately we want to achieve? In the same way that the buyer has a motivation, we have a motivation. There has to be some mutual value, some mutual benefit, because if our motivation takes control, then we are going to go off on a tangent. And perhaps we are missing the signals that our buyers are giving us in terms of what is important to them. The fourth component is social skills. Now, this is all about your ability to communicate. This is all about your ability to build relationships, rapport, work in a team, because sales is a team environment role. And the fifth element is, of course, empathy. And empathy, in very simple terms, is about your ability to see things and feel things from your buyer's perspective. It is about being able to place yourself in the buyer's shoes and start thinking about the pressures on them, perhaps what is important to them, perhaps the motivation on them. What is it that they are really interested in achieving? So that's emotional drivers. They are super important when it comes to buyers making decisions and how sellers react to buyers when they are in that decision-making process. The third element that impacts decision-making is cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are like a mental shortcut that influence a buyer's thinking and their decision-making. They are formed on the back of past experiences and perhaps the expertise that they've had, perhaps what they've heard, perhaps what others have told them about a certain situation, product, service, scenario, etc. What is important to note is that as human beings, both as buyers and sellers, we all have bias. And that bias impacts us in different ways and in different situations. There are lots and lots of different types of biases. In fact, I think it's estimated that there are over 150 different types or forms of cognitive bias that are now recognized. I want to highlight a few of them because I think that these are really important to understand in sales. The first one from a buyer perspective is loss aversion. Now, from a sales perspective, we often talk about growth, about opportunity, about actually what will this new product, this new service enable you to do. From a buyer's perspective, we often need to think about the other way, about loss aversion. Because a lot of buyers are fearful. They are more interested in making sure something doesn't go wrong first and foremost, right? Because the baseline is already there. So growth is great, but from a buyer perspective, actually, they aren't always chasing the gain in the same way that a salesperson is. They are often thinking about, I've got to make sure that this doesn't go the other way. The results don't go the other way. The reporting doesn't go the other way. The numbers don't go the other way. So loss aversion is something that buyers are often worried about. The second one, which is so popular now, is social proof. A lot of buying decisions are shaped by what others are doing. And what you'll see is if you imagine social media, if you imagine most organizations that are selling services or products, everyone has case studies. Everyone has success stories. Everyone has metrics that try to show actually the percentage or improvement that is perhaps available on the back of an organization using their product, implementing their service, and so on and so forth. So social proof is something that really impacts buying decisions. If you don't have social proof attached to your product or your service, actually that's just you and your opinion, as opposed to someone else's opinion, right? So buyers are really interested in understanding how others have experienced working with you, your products, your services, and so on and so forth. Another type of bias is anchoring. Now, what typically happens is that the first number that you hear or the first range of numbers that you hear generally forms your opinion on a particular topic. A good way of thinking about this is imagine you read a report and that report says that actually the average onboarding time for a salesperson is 9 months. Well, you know that you have this particular challenge in your business and you know that it's actually taking you more than 9 months to onboard a new salesperson. That 9-month figure is actually going to be your anchor. you are going to start thinking about how can I get my onboarding for my team to be within that time frame. By the way, 9 months is way too long if it's how long it's taking you to onboard a salesperson. It should be a lot quicker. It should be well within any kind of, how can I say, probationary period that you perhaps have set. Okay, but anchoring is all about anchoring on the first number that you use to benchmark any kind of performance or analyze on. The fourth kind of common cognitive bias is something called confirmation bias. And generally, the best way of explaining this is that buyers have a tendency to favor data that supports their pre-existing view. What I mean by this is if a buyer is already thinking about something in a very specific way or already has an idea of what the solution looks like, if something is presented to them that naturally talks to that solution that they were already at, they're naturally going to be in favor of it. That's what confirmation bias is. So, dual system thinking, emotional drivers, and cognitive biases. These are, for me, three of the most critical elements to understanding how buying decisions are made and how your buyers are ultimately influenced when they are in that process. Now, the most important thing to remember is that all buyers are ultimately human and their decisions are driven by emotion first and then justified by logic. So regardless of whatever is being bought, what is important to understand is that there is a process to how buying decisions happen in the world of B2B sales. Often, well, always actually, there is a trigger. There is a problem, there is an opportunity, there is an external pressure that arises. I'll give you some examples. It could be new regulation. It could be a competitive threat. It could be change of management. There will be a trigger that actually causes the business to pause and say, we need to actually address this. We need to do something different. Now that trigger causes an evaluation and the buyer or the boss, the CEO, the MD, someone within the business actually initiates an evaluation process. And the buyer then starts researching. They start collecting information. They start looking at actually what options are available. They scan the market. They look at social proof. They try and understand actually what is going to be right for them. What have others done similar to them? Now, when they are scanning for these options, they're actually using their own skills. But here's what happens. Their own emotions ultimately guide which vendors feel credible and trustworthy, right? So that bias, that system 1 and system 2 thinking, the emotional drivers that they hold, all of these elements are ultimately guiding their emotions, and they are subconsciously actually using that to say, actually, these ones feel, or this solution, this provider feels more credible than the other. Okay, so logic comes afterwards. Once they've identified the right solution or those providers, they will then apply the logic. They will then look at, okay, do they have case studies? Do they have that social proof, those success stories, and so on and so forth? And they use that to validate the choice that they've made. Now, they will take all of this information, they will create a summary, and then they will present back to the decision-making unit in the business. Now, the decision-making unit in the business will consist in B2B sales of multiple stakeholders that have different motivations, right? And when you are thinking of a buying committee, you're not just going to get the same person from the same background in that buying committee. You're going to get a range of different stakeholders. They're going to have different personalities. They're going to have different emotions. And they're going to think about this in a different way. Let me give you an example. The person from finance is all about the numbers. They want to know, does it make sense economically? Actually, how do we reduce the risk in this? The person who ultimately uses the product or service isn't thinking about the numbers. They're thinking about, is this going to make it easier for me to do my job? Does it mean that I'm going to have to do more? How is it going to impact me personally? That's what they're thinking about. What's in it for me? The CEO is thinking very simply, is it going to help us make money, save money? And perhaps if there's an investor there, they're thinking about, well, what is the return on investment? The point is this, in that decision-making unit, every buyer stakeholder is going to have their own evaluation criteria. They're going to have their own emotions at play, which is going to drive their buying decisions. So it's important that you consider each one of those different types of buyers. Now, the final part of this is that buying committee has to reach consensus and they have to evaluate the risk. And the reason they have to evaluate the risk is that actually a buying committee isn't just making a decision based on a sample of one. They are thinking about the reputational risks to the business. They are thinking about actually our jobs at stake, our promotions at stake, right? And their role is to reduce any perceived risk of change while promoting the benefits of whatever direction they decide to go in. The reason this is important is that it is your role as a salesperson to help them manage that perceived risk. I'm going to give you a really simple example, which I think is apt now, and a lot of companies are doing it. Imagine you use a particular CRM system and your organization has used it for the past 5, 10, 15 years. You know that there is a better system for the way that you work and the type of business that you are operating in. Now, the business will want to ensure that migration, that transition is as smooth and seamless as ever. So the new CRM system, what they should be doing is they should be making that process as simple as possible. They should be involved in that migration and they should probably run both systems in parallel. Okay, so it is that new company's responsibility to de-risk this, to make it as simple as possible, remove any friction that could possibly exist from the process. I'll give you another example that I've seen recently. There was huge amount of chatter that lots of people moving from OpenAI to Claude. So what did Claude do? Claude wrote a prompt that would essentially help a user take all of their history from OpenAI and put it into Claude. So it made that process so simple that it was just, look, if you're looking to make this move, don't worry about what you've done in the past. We'll help you get it all into our system and it will be no friction to you. That's how you manage that perceived risk. Make it as simple as possible for them to say yes, remove as much of the friction that is there. So whether you're aware of it or not, there is always a decision process. And for me, the businesses and the salespeople that succeed often understand that buying process better than their competitors. There is always a buying process. The key is that you need to understand what that is as a salesperson. So oftentimes, right, decisions look rational. When you're engaged in that conversations, they look rational, they look based on logic where everything is mapped out in terms of spreadsheets, in terms of business cases, in terms of procurement processes. But what is super important to understand is that the engine underneath is emotional and it's based on human psychology, which is ultimately driven by feeling and intuition. It is emotional and at times it is irrational. Rational and logical versus emotional and intuitive doesn't always make sense. But the best sellers actually are really good at aligning both. They're really good at understanding both. And what they do is they make the buyer feel really safe and confident. And then they give them the logic to be able to defend that decision internally, right? So the best sellers make the buyers feel safe and confident. And then they give them the logic to defend that decision internally. So with that in mind, I leave you with these 3 takeaways from today's session. Firstly, buying decisions are driven by emotion first and then justified by logic. Secondly, how your brain functions and processes thoughts, feelings, and emotions really impacts on the buying decisions. And finally, effective sellers win by understanding the emotions that are at play for any buyer, addressing any bias that exists, and then guiding the buyer through the decision-making process that they have. Thank you very much for joining. I will stop sharing my screen now and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.